So let me just ask quickly to guide us a little bit. How many people here have read part or all of the book? All right. Wow. We can dig right in. And that's what we love about you guys. So I want to start by asking Jessica a few questions about how a writer thinks and some of her decisions in coming to this topic in this book, so we can get a better sense of your overall interests and process. So let's just open it up and say, where did the idea for this book?
Okay, I'm going to jump into that, but I want to first just say thank you guys so much for coming and for supporting writers, supporting the Harbor Springs Book Festival, which is amazing. And I've been telling as many people as I have talked to tonight what a cool thing it is that you have going here in this community. I've been to lots of book festivals, and very few, if any, are as thoughtfully curated and organized and supportive of writers and really encouraging of readers and writers forming connections and having dialogue. So many similar things are just much more kind of mercenary, and like as a writer you sort of feel like you're the meat on the chopping block and it's like what's next, and this is so opposite from that, and I really think that's a testament to all of you and to Amy's amazing work. I don't know where she is now, but there she is, who drove all the way to Traverse City to pick me up, is driving me back to Traverse City tomorrow, like all of the unseen work that goes into the logistics of pulling an event like this off, and not to mention the event of the actual festival. Anyway, I'm very appreciative, and you should know that from a writer's perspective, this is a really wonderful thing you have, and it's a great opportunity for me to be here among so many wonderful readers who, as I learned last night, have read the book so carefully and thoughtfully. People were asking questions and seeing symbolism that I was like, oh, right, I don't know if I meant that symbol or not, but okay, yeah, I did. So anyway, onwards, but I now need to ask you to repeat the question. Sorry.
Where does the idea for this particular book, where did it start?
Yeah. So each of my books, there's sort of like a different, they come from a different place. And this one, yeah, I'd say in each occasion, there's been kind of a bigger idea and then a smaller seed of something that gets me started. In this case, the bigger idea was I had spent all this time writing and researching the women in the castle, which I was here for in 2018. And I'm a really slow writer and slow researcher. I have 3 kids. It took me over 7 years to write that book. And by the end of that 7 years, I had been really inhabiting, like, what was it like to be German after World War II? What was it like to live with the complicity, with the shame of complicity and guilt and the defeat of your nation? And how did that play out over the next, half century for people's individual lives? And at the end of that time spent thinking about all that, I started thinking about what I see as kind of the inverse, which is, what was it like to be American after World War II? I mean, the two are like exact opposites, because America came out of World War II smelling like a rose. Not only were we victorious, but we were absolutely unequivocally on the right side. And I feel like as a nation, our sense of our own rightness, of everything that we stood for, our own ideology, it was all sort of shored up by we came out of that war. Never mind the extreme personal cost that many people who actually fought in the war experienced. As a nation, we came out of it really proud. And I started thinking, well, so, okay, I spent all this time, how did the German sense of defeat and guilt play out over the next 50 years? How did the American sense of rightness and agency play out over the next half century? And I knew I wanted to explore that question next. And it came from a somewhat personal place, which is that I have grandparents who fought on both sides of that war. I had a German grandfather who was in the Wehrmacht and fought on the Russian front, and my German grandparents were members of the Nazi Party. And that was the driving force of, if we're talking about where did the women in the castle come from, that came from trying to understand that and learn about that for myself and explain that. My American grandfather was in the Marines in World War II. He fought in the Pacific and never spoke about it. He was a real greatest generation, sort of typical, came out of that war. He had 2 Purple Hearts. He had been given the chance to go home, chose to go back and stay with his men. He was a captain in a couple of really, as I learned from my research, bloody battles. And my American grandmother was a code breaker and also never spoke about that experience. I only know as much as that's what she did. That's it. So these kind of provided the springboards of the characters for my book, who are certainly not my grandparents or representations of them, but those were kind of like the circumstances of their lives sort of led to Nick and Bet. So that's sort of the big picture. The seed of the idea kind of crystallized when I was about, around the time that The Women in the Castle came out, maybe as I had just finished writing that. I was headed up to Vermont with my own family to go to the farmhouse that my dad owns there, that used to be owned by his parents and that I grew up going to. That is, it's in southern Vermont, but it actually always felt to me like we were in like the most remote part of Vermont, because it is kind of, it's a dirt road to a dirt road to a dirt road to get to the house. And my family was the kind of family that was like, if we're going to Landgrove, we stock up at the market and nobody goes back into town to get the newspaper. Nobody, if you forgot something, you can't go back to town. Like, it was like, so I sort of had this sense of remoteness about it. So that was kind of like, obviously you can see that worked its way into the book. But I was headed up there, as I said, at the end of Women in the Castle with my family. And I mentioned where I was going to a friend who knew the area, and she said, "Oh, isn't that the valley where all the old CIA guys go to retire?" And I was like, I didn't know anything about that. Interesting. And I'm a fiction writer. So if I were a nonfiction writer, maybe I would have tried to unearth the exact truth of how many old CIA guys there might or might not be retired in this community. But as a fiction writer, I instead started thinking like, my grandfather was in the oil industry. He traveled a lot to the Middle East. And all of that sort of took on a new cast. And I started thinking, well, if there were a lot of CIA agents retired in this valley, what would they be escaping to, and what would they be escaping from? And that was kind of like the seeds that planted the actual book. So that's sort of a long answer to that question.
Oh, that's terrific. So what I'm hearing a lot of is writing and thinking at the same time, writing and researching. Are you writing at the same time? Are you writing scenes and characters at the same time that you're
researching it? Yeah, so I am. It's interesting. I think a lot of people who do historical research for their books, I'm sure everybody does it differently, but I think a lot of people do it the way I do, which is I sort of start with, I have to read a bunch to ground myself in whatever I'm writing about. So I read some memoirs, some really great nonfiction books about the early CIA, and then you start writing. And the characters have sort of started to come into your head. You start writing, and you write yourself until you get to the next thing that you don't know. And then you do a little more research, and then you do a little more writing. And then you realize, it's the next thing that I don't know, and I need to do a little more research on that. So the two definitely go hand in hand. And a lot of the research, the tricky part is that sometimes the research is so interesting that you want to work it all into your book. And you can't, and you have to find ways you kind of have to, that's where the editing comes in. And I'm constantly editing as I work, for better or worse. Sometimes I wish I could just keep pushing through, but it's like, wait, I have to, no, we don't need that particular instance. Even though it's interesting, I'll save that for another book. But yeah, the two are really, it's a hand-in-hand process for me.
And, you're talking about these great gestures in history and reading about them, but one of the things I like about both of these most recent books is that the grand gestures of history stand out at the sidelines, and you see the ordinary people in the center of the story. So as you're doing all this research, how are those characters coming together and coming alive?
Yeah, well, I like that way of putting it, and I think that is sort of the beauty of writing historical fiction, although I don't know if I necessarily think of this book specifically as historical fiction in that particular genre, but it gives you the chance to explore history through a personal, emotional, individual lens, as opposed to sort of the bird's eye view or kind of learning, the pieces and the facts. It's like you get inside it. And to me, that's fascinating. And in this case, and in the case of The Women in the Castle, it was like I actually had the double benefit of learning all of this history, getting inside my characters' heads, and also kind of getting to know my own grandparents more, because I was thinking about some of these particular historical moments that they lived through and thinking, what was it like to be, raising your kids in a suburb of New York City in during the Rosenberg trials. That was a whole thing that ended up on the cutting room floor. I don't think that's in the final. But you really, I think it's different for readers, and as well it is for writers, that you kind of get into what are the manifestations of that? How does that, when you're cooking dinner and you're listening to the radio and you hear that Ethel Rosenberg was just executed, where does that put you, and how are you thinking about that? So it's kind of a different way to experience history.
And a way of practicing a kind of imaginative empathy, right? To put yourself into Bet's character, who has such a profound reaction to the
Yeah, and you asked, how do I come up with the characters? I mean, I feel like the coming up with the characters is really, it's interesting because I don't sit down and think I'm going to come up with this character. I'm not like, there are writers who will write they'll have a worksheet that's where were they born and what is their favorite color? And I've never done that. I'm sure maybe that could be helpful, but who knows? I'll never say never, maybe next book. But it's usually the characters kind of present themselves to me. And then sometimes I'll write my way into something where it's well, wait, okay, she's meeting her dad. Who is her dad? And what kind of childhood what relationship does she have with him? And so it sort of becomes, it's like a process of, through the writing, the character becomes clearer and clearer to me.
So you didn't have this set nuclear family before you started in your head?
Well, I knew what I had to begin with was Nick and Bet, and I had Carter. I knew he was going to be in it. And I actually had the last generation, which those of you who have read the book have gotten to at the end. And in fact, the way I was first writing the book, I had it bookended with the blackout and the current day generation. And then through time, that ended up being at the end of the book. But I actually didn't really have Catherine and Harry, at least I didn't have them from their point of view. I did know that I knew Catherine and Harry were Nick and Bet's children, but I didn't know I was going to get into their whole section of the book.
I see.
That evolved.
So it's one of the things I really love about this book is the way characters are in kind of pairs or opposition or dyads. There's the married couple, there's their children, so you have mother-daughter relationship, you have the husband and wife relationship, but an abiding relationship throughout this entire novel is Nick and Carter.
Yeah.
And we had talked a little bit beforehand that it might be helpful for you all to just hear a little bit of Jessica reading from the book. And last night she had read the beginning of the prologue, and when I was listening to it, I thought, oh wait, you stopped at the Nick and Carter part. So I'm going to ask her to pick up and read that last part.
Yeah, I'm glad, and I like that you like Carter and wanted to hear more about him. It's funny, he's emerging as a real character that people are interested in. One of the I mean, I guess that's clear because he's a big part of the book. But one of the recent In Conversations I did was with someone who got very into that she would have, if she had known Carter, she thought he was so sexy, she definitely would have had an affair with him. and her husband raised his hand in the audience and was like, "What? Wait a minute, what's going on here?" So that was kind of a funny moment. But I kind of saw Carter that way too, like he is a ladies' man, and he's a very charming, like in the old school charming sense type of person. So, okay, I'm gonna pick up kind of where I left off from the prologue I was reading before. And this is while they're on the airplane flying over Abadan oil field, right at the beginning of the book, when Nick first encounters Carter. Nick had taken the job, and the job we're talking about is the job at American Oil. Nick had taken the job with grand ideas about international law as the only bulwark between peace and conflict, civilization and chaos. Without it, humans were no better than animals rutting about in the fields, taking what they wanted, eating those in their way. That was why he had gone to law school in the first place. In retrospect, his idealism seemed naive. So far, his job had been mundane, even tedious. Of course, it had accomplished another and arguably more important goal. It had laid the foundation for a solid, upwardly mobile Taylor family life. His wife did not have to work her fingers to the bone the way his mother had. His children were growing up with toys and dentistry and indoor plumbing, and that was progress, wasn't it? When Nick returned to his place, a tall, craggy-faced man had plopped himself down in the seat beside his. "Mind if I join you, Taylor?" the man asked. The man, his name was Carter Weston, had been in Nick's class at Yale. They had been more acquaintances than friends. Nick was a poor scholarship boy from the Midwest, the son of a Mennonite minister, and Carter was a fourth-generation prep school type, tall and blonde, a member of the school's most elite social clubs. They had both studied history of the Near East. In Nick's case, this was almost by accident, some arm twisting on the part of the head of the scrappy, newly funded department who needed more students to enroll. In Carter's case, on account of a formative passion for Rudyard Kipling novels. For a time, both men had played on the same amateur ice hockey team. Now Carter held out a glass to Nick. "This is what you're drinking, right?" Nick accepted the glass, although in fact he'd been drinking water for the past half hour. For those of you who haven't read the book, they're all kind of drunk. They've been on this plane drinking bourbon for a while. Carter didn't work with American Oil or any of the other oil companies represented on this flight. He worked for the government. But in the Middle East, Nick was learning, there seemed to be a great deal of overlap. "Can I ask you a question, Taylor?" Carter said, rapping his knuckles on the window. "What do you see when you look down there?" Nick glanced out at the idle oil field receding in the twilight. "Abadan," he answered. "Ha, fair enough. But I mean more broadly, potential, opportunity, a headache?" Nick considered. "All of the above." Carter nodded. "You know what I see? A battlefield, a Gettysburg or an Agincourt, a place people will point to and say, that was where it was decided. That was the turning point." Nick regarded Carter skeptically, but the man seemed to be serious. "Of?" A fierce look came over Carter's face. The battle between communism and democracy, freedom and oppression, liberty and conformity. The battle over the future of civilization, no less. "All right," Nick said. It was a grandiose statement, even for a man like Carter, and for a moment, Nick had the impulse to laugh. The fact was, however, at base, he agreed, though he would never have said anything so dramatic out loud. "So how do you propose to win it?" he asked instead. Carter leaned in, a lock of blonde hair falling into his face. Nick remembered a joke from their ice hockey days. "Weston will bite your nose off if you get too close when he's excited." "This battle," Carter said, "will be fought in a new way, not with guns and bombs and battleships, but with intelligence and the pulling of delicate strings." Nick raised his eyebrows. "Attached to what and by who?" Carter laughed. As quickly as the intensity had overcome him, he became once again jovial. "You're a clever man, Taylor," he said. "That's just what I was getting to." I'll stop there.
Isn't that a great section? So in a lot of ways, I mean, it's a perfect prologue. It sets the terms for the story, doesn't it? And I felt it was so clear, especially as we learn more about Nick and his background and where he comes from, the kind of faith he placed in the law and the potential to offer stability. But Carter, he's another, ostensibly, they're both looking for the same thing. But what's Carter up to?
Yeah, so I kind of thought of Carter as, they're obviously coming from really different backgrounds. And Carter I see as a real, where Nick is an idealist, Carter is kind of an opportunist. And he's an adventurer. He's really like sort of this, I felt in some ways he was kind of representing that like American spirit of adventurism. Whereas Nick is a little bit more in the camp of an earnest, like he really believes the American way and our system of laws and order is the right way, and it is what he thinks is sort of, he's really believing that in such a way that it makes sense to him to go and interfere with other countries to help them have that. And especially when it comes to oil, he's really committed to, like, he wants to be a part of the proper and like orderly divvying up of this resource, which otherwise is arguably could very well start a war. It's a huge cache of oil sitting there that a lot of people in a lot of countries want a piece of. And he really believes in the law as sort of what keeps people safe, and he wants to be there to represent that. But Carter, yeah, he's sort of a left and right. He's an adventurer, whether it's with the ladies or with his work with the CIA. He's out there living life, kind of.
Do you think, it may be a funny question to ask, is he out for himself or is he also out for America?
I guess that's a good question. He's sort of out for America, and then I think both he and Nick really do believe like that they're worried about communist, about the USSR taking over Iran's oil, which we were just talking about this right beforehand, but that seems a little like far-fetched to us now, but the USSR shared a border with Iran, and it occupied northern Iran at the end of World War II, and it actually didn't clear out on the schedule that was set at the end by the Allies to say, okay, you're supposed to retract at this point, and they didn't. They were in Iran. I think it was 48 or 49. I should know that for sure. But anyway, there were a lot of people in the U.S. government, for real, not just in this book, who were really scared of a balance of power shifting totally cataclysmically, so that if the USSR had all this oil, that would be it, and that was the end of freedom and democracy in America. And I think that Carter believes in that too. So in that way, he is out for America, but he's kind of also out for himself. He's a greedy guy. Like, he wants things that aren't his, right? And you see that play out with his relationship with Bet. Like, he's like an avaricious character.
What about, I'm thinking about his interest in Nick's family and going from certainly his interest in Bet and having something that can't be his. Does he have an interest in Harry?
Well, in the end, there's this sort of tricky, I don't want to give things away for the people who haven't read it, but he and Harry have some moments, and he is kind of interested in, like, there was a whole section of research that I did that got very minimally into this book about the CIA involvement with the late 60s protest movement. Which we know more about the FBI infiltrating that, but the CIA was sort of hand in hand with the FBI doing some of that. And so I did picture Carter at that moment in time being kind of interested in, like, what he could learn about from this younger generation that he has access to partly because he wanted the information to pass on to do some of the work they were doing, which was to try to figure out, there were wiretaps and, plants who were doing things that were creating problems in the protest movement to make it look like more violent than it was, and all that, yeah.
It's interesting. And, throughout the book, I think I used the word, I felt like he was not exactly a supernatural character, but a little bit of a trickster, and you had said that you thought of Puck.
Yeah. Puck was definitely I was thinking of Puck the whole time I was writing Carter.
And by that,
just in that sort of adventurous, like he likes to mix things up. He likes to get people on their toes, and it's a little bit of a way of exerting power. And that triangle between him and Bet and Nick is sort of part of his power play.
Absolutely. Let's shift a little bit. I want to stay in the Middle East and in Nick's time in the Middle East. If I remember correctly, he initially mentions Persepolis to Carter just to kind of get him off his back, right? I forget why Carter brings it up, but Carter arranges for Nick to see Persepolis. And for me, that whole section of the story and the history of it and the kind of symbolic weight has a big specific gravity in the story. And I wonder how you came to that.
Yeah. Well, so as you take a lot of inspiration from the pieces of research that you're doing, and some of that research is reading books and memoirs, as I've talked about, but some of it is also just stumbling across stuff online. And at some point, very early on in writing this book, I came across the documentary. You can find it on YouTube. It's it's like 40-minute documentary made quite a while ago that has actual footage of the Persepolis party. And some of you may remember even like reading about it at the time, because everyone was a little fascinated. I thought it's this idea of the greatest party that the world has ever seen, and the tabloids I'm talking in real life as well as in the book now, had a field day with this and all of the headlines and it was so splashy. And I watched this documentary which shows some of the footage of these amazing silken tents that have been erected in what is basically a desert, and it talks about the plane loads full of champagne and the catering from Maxime's of Paris that's also flown in, and the foie gras everything is like imported, which is significant. Almost nothing came from Iran, including the people who were working there and all of the waiters in their Lanvin uniforms. And I was really taken with that story of the songbirds flown in, and that they were all, to tweet, to chirp sweetly from the trees that the Shah had planted along the road, but they all dropped dead because it was totally the wrong climate. Now, interestingly, I will say something, this will get us, I'll get lost in my own train of thought here, but I had, right now in publishing, there's a thing where you have sensitivity readers who read for accuracy and perspective to make sure that you're not like overstepping. So I had an Iranian sensitivity reader, which was really interesting. He was a great reader, and he was really into the book, and he called it radically fair, which I loved. It was like, wow, I think I've never had a better compliment. But one of his little tweaks was like, he was like, that bit about the songbirds, that's like well known in Iran, but we're not sure if that's true or if that's one of those like urban legends. It definitely was written about in the newspapers, but it's like, I don't know. So that's sort of interesting. But I don't think that it's presented in the book, as nobody's actually seen it with they're all reading about it in the papers too. But anyway, all that stuff just really captured my imagination, and I knew when I saw this documentary that they had to go there to this party, and that it was definitely going to be a point of reckoning for Nick, where he was going to be kind of like faced with what was ultimately the result of all this work he'd done. And he was it was very different than what he was thinking when he was in 1951 on the ground there and thinking about law and order and American democracy and divvying up the oil in a proper way and bringing progress to Iran. It was like he wasn't picturing, oh, there's going to be this level of total decadence and excess that has been created by the oil money that has ended up in this, in different people's pockets in this way. And that I felt was like, once I had that, it was like, I know what I'm writing toward for Nick. That's his come to Jesus moment.
And I'll just spend a moment talking about a documentary I saw about Persepolis. We watched about the beginning of this civilization in ancient times, and I was so taken by the idea that this emperor who basically conquered the entire Middle East, all the way to Russia, huge amounts of land, stood out as one of the few rulers who let the people that he conquered continue to be themselves. So it was truly this kind of multiplicitous society where people could continue to live as they had lived, and it was a very peaceful period until it wasn't. And so I was taken by this idea of this kind of which I think probably is what Nick was picking up on in school.
Yeah,
right?
I mean that apparently the founding fathers read these accounts of that empire, because it was supposedly the first empire that had like human rights and that let everyone keep their own cultures, and it was a benevolent empire, or at least everything that's that historical is like who knows what really was going on and who was putting that narrative on it. But it was I thought, to me, that was part of why I wanted them to go there, because it was kind of like that ties into Nick's. Nick is going to have all these romantic feelings about that place, basically.
Yes, and so it really meant something to him and his ethos. And at the end of the story of Persepolis, at least as we saw it in our little documentary, the archaeologists are there at the beginning, and they're like, yes, we've uncovered these ruins that have been buried for 7,000 years. And it's like these gigantic things and you're just like, how does that just disappear? How has it gone for 7,000 years? Which is an idea I'm going to want to pick up again with the Lasts and Last Valley.
We are going to be here for 2 hours.
So one other touch point on the Middle East. Will you tell people how the Huma came into?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about endings and beginnings, and I talked a little about this last night. But originally this book was called The Age of Oil, and my editor was like, "That's not a very sexy title, so we're not going to call it that. That sounds like nonfiction, and nobody wants to hear about oil." But I was thinking about it as I was writing it as a very distinct age, and as it was becoming clearer and clearer in this moment that we're sort of starting in 2018 when I was writing this, and the giant climate action report came out. It was like, we need to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. So how we do that remains to be seen, really. But I was thinking about this specific age and all of the things that we have, all of the comforts that we have lived with since World War II. And that made me think of like, well, so, there's the Stone Age, there's the Bronze Age, there are all these kind of ages of time, and they're defined by different things, and they involve a very different way of human life. And all of them have beginnings and endings, and then the hummingbird is it represents the world ending, and then it begins again, and the world ends again, and the world begins again. And that to me was sort of a theme I was playing with in this book, or I was kind of thinking about in the back of my mind. And I'm leaving the characters in this moment of like, are we at the end of this age? Are we at the beginning of a new age? Are the lights just coming right back on, and we're gonna just be in like 3/4 of the way through this age? There are a lot of questions, but I was thinking about those cycles, and the hummingbird to me, like many there are a lot of cultures that have that kind of mythological creature that represents that.
I'm going to move us over to the U.S. now because sadly I don't have 2 hours and I'm running out of time. So somebody in my book group last night said something very astute, and I'm curious of your take on it. She felt that Harry was a real cipher because we saw the family from the internal perspectives of 3 of the 4 members, but we don't see Harry. Why did you do that?
I've been asked that before. I don't really have a good answer. I mean, I think maybe the simplest answer is that it would be too sad.
To be inside him.
Yeah. I don't think I've written a character who died. I mean, I've written characters who die at the end of the book, but like to be, I don't know, maybe that's part of it. I just didn't, I didn't think of, I felt like Catherine was a big bossy older sister, and that was whose perspective we were going to hear this from.
And along those lines, so up until part 2, we've got a third-person narrator, right? So we can kind of see inside different people's minds. And then in part 2, it's first person. And is there more to it than that she was a big bossy person and you wanted to give her a full voice?
I think that was part of it, and also it just worked. Like as a writer, you start trying to write things and you got to find your voice for what you're writing. And for her section, I definitely had a few different attempts where I was writing it in the third person. And they just weren't, I think of it as like, does it come off the ground? And just, do you stop thinking about the writing and it exists? And it just wasn't quite, and then I started writing the first person and it felt like, oh, this is how she's gonna tell her story. And I also think that her generation is such a generation of individuals, and individualism is so important and vital to her and to many people of her age. So it made sense that way to me.
And one more from the book group. So this is a story that happens through time in a macro kind of way. It's roughly chronological. But time is slippery, and you tell the story a little forward and backward. What is a writer thinking of doing there when you're moving a story forward, but you're creating a kind of, I guess I would call it psychological time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just sort of, that's part of the process of putting the pieces together in the end. And as I said, I was originally thinking of starting in the present, like bookending it with the present, and then it felt more compelling to start with the past. That was sort of where I wanted to just tell the story from the beginning. I'm interested in the beginnings of bad things, like the good beginnings of bad things, or what I think of as the kind of lightness that sometimes precedes even something that ends up really darkly, can begin with a lot of the kind of idealism and good intentions that Nick begins with. And so that felt like I wanted to trace that trajectory that way. But there are other places in the book, like something that came up, I don't remember if this is what you're talking about, but last night we were talking about how you learn that Harry dies before, but you don't know how he dies. That's a little bit of a writer's trick to, up the ante. Like that's, you wanna get people to, there's a little bit of a mystery there, like, wait a minute, what happened? He died. You're hopefully gonna keep turning the pages because you wanna find out. So that was sort of, and I also, that section where Catherine's talking about that that felt like the introduction to Catherine, and she gives that information away, so.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great insight. All right, let's get to the lasts. I guess the easiest way to ask is, how do you think of them? Why do we not know what happened to them?
Yeah, so the lasts were, I think they're a little bit, they fit into that kind of beginnings and endings, and like they had their time at Last House, and that ended, and on to the next. Like there isn't, I wasn't gonna, and they're also not the characters in my book, but I did feel like their ghosts are sort of lingering, or at least John Last's ghost as this kind of, there's a loneliness to the house. And I thought of that being like left over from that, Bet's initial introduction to the house as this place that the last person who lived here was this guy with 7 children, a widower, and he was the last person remaining in this valley. And and then in the next generation of the grandchildren, they're always talking about like, this is where we come when the world ends. And it's kind of like, if we're the last people, there's a little bit of like, I thought of Nick and Bet as kind of early preppers, or actually Carter the most as a sort of early prepper. And then the grandchildren are like, they're not really preppers because they don't have like a bunker. It's not actually scientifically going to make any sense. But that idea of sort of where do you come when the world ends? Anyway, so John Last sort of went through that. And I also really liked the fact that last has different meanings here. So it's the name of the guy, but it's also like potentially the last place that these characters will be. And endings obviously are important to me in this book, and that worked in that way.
So this is a really unfair question, but I'm sure you guys feel this way too. Like, don't you read books and you wish you had the writer in front of you and you could say, what were you thinking when you were doing that? And so my question is, when you were writing, and really in this book, which I felt like so many things just matched perfectly, and I even can give you, if you guys want afterwards, a little theory of the lasts, but I'm obsessed with them. And but I want to know, as the writer, you know a lot more about the story that ends up in the book. So do you know about the last?
Well, so actually that's interesting. There was, when we talked earlier about pieces of research, like how research can be inspiring and then it can lead you into different scenes and even characters and places in the book. But also sometimes you have to excise some of that research because it doesn't end up belonging. But one of the things that I came across when I was thinking about Vermont and what was going on in the 50s, like how would Carter have come to be bringing them up to this place, was that there were a lot of valleys in Vermont, like the one that my dad has a house in, that were occupied during the lumber and textile time before the Depression. And they were built up at that time, and it was kind of, I wouldn't say boom times, but it was like a decent economy, and there were a lot of people living there. And then Vermont really depopulated during the Depression, when a lot of these lumber businesses went out of business, and textiles went out of business. And so there were valleys like Last Valley, which in this case, this comes from the valley that I grew up going to, that went into like full-on foreclosure, and all the houses were basically abandoned. And then people in our valley that we go to, there is a family who came in the early 50s and bought a whole lot of houses and then sold them to friends and had their own family there. And so I thought that's like a little piece of history that didn't really work its way in, but I found that really interesting. And Vermont has this funny history of that because it kind of was booming or whatever, something. It was it had a decent sized population. Then it really emptied out. And then back there's some year like 1972 or something, where Vermont became the only state in the country to grow, but it wasn't like immigration. It was whatever you call it, internal, like Americans going, because there was the whole back to the land where like kind of a hippie feeling, like, and there were a lot of back to the landers who started some communes and things like that in Vermont. So anyway, I don't think that really ended up. Was a little bit of that in the book with Candy, but anyway, that gives you a little more color on the lasts, maybe.
Yes. Thank you.
I don't know. You'll have to write the book on the lasts.
I had quite a lot of scenarios,
Oh,
but
good.
did I
Well,
go to
there
the
you go.
history? No, I didn't know the Depression piece. That's interesting. Yeah. All right, I think our portion of this is wrapping up soon, but I have a few more questions. You and I had been, I know, right? I'm sorry. Would that you could have the microphone, but you can't. So we talked a little bit about inside baseball of publishing and that, and one of the things I'm always curious about is covers. Do you get a say in the cover? Do you bring cover ideas? Do they say, let us do our thing, this is a business?
Yeah. So this is a pretty nice cover, right? I mean, I really, this is of my books. This is the first time I got a cover and I loved it. Like I have, and I'm not a picky I mean, I'm sort of like, okay, you know how to make a cover, you know, because you worked at HarperCollins. They do a lot of figuring out, and the salespeople know this and that, and these people. So I defer to all of that expertise. But this time I really loved it. And it's actually a little bit of a cool story. I have no idea if we're like going over time or not, but I'll tell you really quickly. The artist who illustrated it is Spanish, and he lives in Spain. He doesn't speak English. So they chose some passages from the book to translate into Spanish and send to him. And he read those and came up with this. And interestingly, I feel that he's obviously never been to my family's house in Vermont. And he really captured, it really looks a lot like that, not the city in the background, but the house and the way it's laid out. And he put this like pond lake thing, and we have that. Wow. But I don't think that's mentioned anywhere in the book. I don't think that was in any of the passages that they sent him. So I was like, wow, this is like some strange mental alchemy that has happened. But yeah, anyway, I usually don't have a lot of say. I mean, I think I could be, there are writers who will like throw their gauntlet down and be like, I will not have that cover. I haven't done that so far. But it can happen. But mostly it's really the publisher kind of has their vision.
And by request from a number of people, what are you working on now?
Okay. So I'm really at the early stages of what I'm working on. So I'm going to give you a little snapshot, but I'm not going to get into a lot of detail because I don't have that like quite settled in my head. But I will tell you it's mostly contemporary, but it deals with the theme of history. And how I feel like in both this book and The Women in the Castle, I thought a lot about how we reckon with our own history and what it means to do that, and what it is. What is it even for? Why do we do that? And so in the book that I'm working on now, it's actually a contemporary set of characters who are kind of they are literally, there's an unearthed piece of history that they are confronted with. They live on a point of land that has been in the family for a really long time, and they're like can trace their ancestors to the American Revolution, and suddenly there's a piece of history that's unearthed and literally kind of thrown in their doorsteps. And the book sort of follows how there are 4 different parts of the family and how they grapple with that and the tension and drama that ensues, because people feel really strongly about history is a big part of the stories we tell ourselves and who we are. So it seems it's not uncommon that we have really powerful feelings about that, and when confronted with different ways of dealing with it, we have differences. So that's kind of what it's about.
So Amy, what happens now? People get to ask their.
And I'll take the mic around.
Okay. Thank you.
Jessica, I have a friend who is a historian, and she's commented to me her frustration with people thinking they are learning history by reading historical fiction. And I'm curious as to how that plays into your decision as to how you portray a historical time period. Are you concerned about it? Do you feel an obligation to it, or do you think people just ought to be smarter than that and read real accounts, not think that's
Yeah, no, I feel like I can't speak for all historical fiction writers, certainly, but the ones that I know and respect do their research, and you are worried when you're writing the book that you're going to get something wrong, and you really want to, like, if I'm saying there's a full moon on the night before Martin Luther King was killed, I'm going to verify that and see if there was a full moon. Like, even if that's not a part of the plot, it just needs to be accurate. I don't want to open up doors that are like to feeling like, oh wait, what's true? I don't like reading a book if I'm like confused. I actually felt I loved Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, but I found it kind of jarring and confusing. That I was like, wait, what? Where did that? Like, it sounds stupid to say that. Like, I knew it didn't work the way it worked. I knew there was no train, but then it was like, well, where's the fantasy begin and end? I don't know. So in my books, I'm almost like maybe too beholden to the history sometimes, where it feels like, well, I could really make this would be really cool if this would happen, but it's like, but it didn't happen. So I can't. So I feel that it's actually, I think if you're reading a good work of historical fiction, you are getting introduced to history. And I hope that if you're interested in it, you go and read some nonfiction accounts, and like anything you read, I hope you check your sources and you read different points of view and all that. But I would take issue with your friend's idea that like inevitably you're just learning like inaccuracies.
So one of the things I really appreciated, I thought you did so deftly, was the exploration of class in this story, and how we see Nick's humble origins and his Mennonite upbringing and this hardscrabble existence, and then kind of working his way up in this very like archetypal like American dream, and then Bet, who comes from more privilege but still like somewhat othered as being like Irish Catholic, and then they're interacting with Carter, who I think is from like a very waspy milieu, and so and then the children are then transcendent. You know, they've transcended their parents' class, and then just the way that reverberates through the whole book. So I just wondered if you would talk about that a little bit, because I thought that was so well done.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I mean, I think it's part of the story of post-war America, right? That it is like it's part of the story of America in general, that you can, like, obviously there are a lot of limitations, but there are many people for whom it works to pull yourself up, and that there is more mobility than there is in a lot of, like, say, Western Europe or something, more entrenched societies. So I feel like it's kind of organic to when writing about that. But I really was interested in progress and our American reverence for the idea of progress. And like Nick feels like oil is progress, and he's all in on that. And it's only kind of toward the end of the book that he's like, wait, maybe progress isn't always good. But so far in his life, it's been about progress, and his own progress as a you know, from a financial and an economic point of view, and his place in society and how much he's kind of power he has in it has been one of progress. And it's sort of so I think that played out. I feel like that played out in that a little. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I'm glad that resonated with you, and I think it is really, that there were so many, the GI Bill after World War II, it kind of made, like, really enabled a lot of, like, characters like Nick to go from nothing to something, and so it was a moment of really capturing the best of the, although now we know that the GI Bill was only there mainly for white people, so not really the best of, but for them, it captured that narrative. Yeah.
Why did you end the book in 2026?
Oh, I know. People keep asking that. The short answer is that I actually, it speaks to the first question, that in my reality-based, like, I got to get everything right, I really didn't want people to be like, this happened in 2023. Wait, there wasn't a big blackout in New England. Like, that didn't happen. So I just wanted the blackout to be in the near future. So you wouldn't be like, it didn't happen. Although, yeah, all of you are like, yeah, but it did happen.
question is to the relationship between Bette and Catherine. And just, you saw, I think it kind of is so familiar to that time period, but Bette was such a person that you wanted to see grow and be able to do things, and she didn't always get to do that. And Catherine was on the other end, so how did that dynamic play?
Yeah, I felt like that they were so similar, but Catherine couldn't really see the similarities. She was too caught up in her, she's too young and caught up in her own life and her own individuality and individuation to be like, actually, my mom was kind of like me. And I tried to work in that part where she learns that her mom was a code breaker, and she's like, what? How did I did sort of the first glimmer of like, oh, you did your own cool stuff, like that's occurring to her. I mean, I think as a mother and as a daughter, I felt like I could really relate to these characters, and that relationship I could relate to both sides of. And I am close enough to my own youth that I remember being like embarrassed by the older generation and any sort of attempt. Like my dad would always be trying to like listen to, you know, I don't know, what was it? The Eurythmics. And I was like, oh God, Dad, why are you trying to listen to the Eurythmics with us? This doesn't, you know, but then as a parent, I see my own kids doing that to me, and I'm like, but that's okay, like I thought you guys are you're being mean. So.
Katie.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. So a question for both of you. Jessica, as a writer, I wonder how you view the writer's place in the world today and how that maybe has changed since the beginning of your career as a writer. And Kate, similarly, as a reader, you know, how do you feel what the role of a writer is in the world today, and maybe how has that changed since you started in publishing and in this industry?
After you, my dear.
Oh. Okay. That's a great question. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is just that this is part of my appreciation for all of you, that you're reading books and thinking about them, and you're buying books, and that is so supportive of writers and writing and thinking. And I feel like something that has changed is people are reading less and less, and you're a rare species here. Although the heartening thing about going on book tour is that I meet a lot of great readers all over the country in different places, which always is like, oh great, there are people reading and engaging with ideas and talking with each other and having book groups and all that. But I do know from the numbers that that's going down, especially for literary fiction. There's a lot more people reading like horror and fantasy and whatever. So I don't know if that exactly speaks to your point. What I think of my role as a writer is just a storyteller, and to get conversations going and engage. I mean, I get to indulge myself, that I get to live, like we talked about last night, I'm living in two worlds at once. I'm living my life and I'm living in the life of the book, and that's pretty special for me. But I'm also hoping that I'm putting something out in the world that will provide either solace, maybe there's something that you see that resonates with you, and that's what I feel like as a reader, that I want to get that from books, and ideas and springboards for conversation and thought. So, and that, I guess I felt like that in the beginning too. That hasn't really changed for me.
A less uplifting take. Katie and I have talked about this a lot. What I noticed over the course of my time, and I was at a major commercial publisher, and at the end of the day, our job is to make money. And so we always had, as I mentioned to Jessica earlier, think of it like the stock market. You invest in different kinds of books, and they serve different populations. And literary fiction was the one that was always most important to me. But there is, genre fiction and a whole bunch of fiction that I think of as entertainment. And, you know, I think of it like Netflix fiction. You know, you just want a story, you want to pass the time. And that has a worthy function, I think, in society too. But what I have seen, I would say, precipitously since COVID, is a move towards entertainment fiction. And it is harder and harder to ask people to read a thoughtful book and expect an audience. And so, you know, I echo Jessica that it's just like a gift to get an audience of people who will say, yeah, give me something with a bunch of ideas and let's talk about those ideas and let them bounce off each other. And, you know, I feel like having worked in a bookstore, that was the thing that drew me to it. And I guess I will toss it back, or a kudos to Katie in that bookstores really curate for you in such a remarkable way. They will give you any entertainment you want, they will carry all the popular entertainments, but they are there to just find these things that help you think about the world and feel more emotionally nourished and make you understand and feel different lives. And, you know, so once again, you guys have a remarkable gift up here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ask a question. All right. Thanks.
One more. No pressure, Kelly. I thought I was a thoughtful reader. I talked about the book with Kate a lot for months and months, but I noticed this afternoon when I read the blurbs on the back of the book for the first time, this mention of the last house as a place people went to heal. That last house healed people. And I realized, oh my God, that's true. That was true for Nick and Beth, and that I just totally missed that. But did you?
I mean, I didn't think of it in that exact term of healing, but I thought of it as an escape, but in a positive way. So I guess that's similar. That like for each of them, it provides something where they're like getting out of their day-to-day lives and the pressures of the larger world around. It's kind of like the return to nature. I mean, it is a return to nature because it's in the middle of nowhere, but that was sort of how I saw it, that they were coming there as a way. It was like outside of the run of history and life and all that. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Another round of applause for Jessica
And can I just want to add a special round of applause for Kate because she is an amazing reader and had the best questions. And it is so much nicer to be up here with someone having a conversation than it is when I'm just like giving a talk. So I really appreciate that, and you did an amazing job.
Wonderful. Jessica will be available